The wind in that part of the country had a name, and it was a name spoken with the kind of respect usually reserved for a hanging judge. They called it the Gray Widowmaker, a relentless, soul-scouring force that came down from the northern peaks without apology and stripped the warmth from stone and bone alike. It was this wind that Alara felt was her true inheritance, more so than the worthless scrap of land her late husband Liam had left her. The wind and the debt. The debt was a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the wind was the cold that seeped through it. Liam had been a man of grand dreams and shallow pockets, a combination that had left Alara, at 29, a widow with nothing but a name on a deed and the pitying glances of the townsfolk in the valley below. Her home, the one she had shared with him, had been sold to cover the most pressing of his creditors. The furniture, the linens, the very pots she cooked in, all liquidated in a quiet, humiliating auction, where neighbors bid on the fragments of her life with solemn faces. What remained was a small wooden chest containing Liam's few personal effects, her own worn clothes, and the deed. The deed was for a parcel of land high on the stony shoulder of the mountain, a place the locals called the Goat's Folly. It was a patch of earth so notoriously barren, so exposed to the elements, that for generations it had been a punchline, a cautionary tale about bad investments. It had belonged to Liam's estranged uncle, a man as stubborn and unforgiving as the land itself, and it had passed to Liam, and now to her, a legacy of uselessness. She had walked up to it once, the day after the auction. The path was little more than a suggestion, a faint trail that snaked through gorse and skeletal heather. The land itself was a testament to nature's indifference. Granite bones broke through the thin skin of the soil, and the wind, the ever-present widowmaker, tore at her shawl and hair, a constant whining predator. In the center of the plot stood the ruins of an old shepherd's bothy, a tumble of moss-eaten stones that looked as if a giant had kicked it over in a fit of pique. It offered no shelter, only a more concentrated sense of decay. This was hers, this monument to failure. The final bitter joke of a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. Her brother-in-law, Alistair, had met her at the bottom of the path that day. He was a thick, prosperous man, the kind whose success was measured in the tightness of his waistcoat and the condescension in his voice. He had none of Liam's charm and all of the family's grasping practicality. He had offered her a pittance for the deed, a sum that would have barely fed her for a month, framing it as an act of charity. "Let me take this burden from you, Alara," he had said, his eyes not meeting hers, instead fixed on the barren slope above. "It's no place for a woman alone. Sell it to me. Go back to your people before the first snow. The mountain doesn't care for grief." She saw the hunger in his eyes then, a flicker of avarice that belied his charitable tone. He didn't want to help her. He wanted the land, for reasons she couldn't fathom, and he was banking on her desperation. Some dormant, iron-hard piece of her own stubbornness, a thing she thought grief had scoured away, rose up. She refused. The look on his face, a brief flash of raw frustration, told her she had been right. So she stayed. With the last of her money, she bought a canvas tent, a few tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a heavy mallet, and sacks of dried beans and flour. The people in the general store treated her with a careful, almost clinical kindness. They saw a woman unmoored by sorrow, making decisions that bordered on madness. They sold her what she asked for, but spoke to each other in low murmurs when she turned away. She was a tragedy in motion, and they were merely spectators. She pitched her tent in the relative lee of the collapsed bothy, the thin canvas snapping and popping in the ceaseless wind, a sound like a frantic, trapped bird. Her first nights were a torment of cold and fear. The wind was a living thing, a wolf circling her flimsy shelter, probing for a way in. It moaned through the tumbled stones of the ruin, a chorus of old sorrows. Sleep was a shallow, shivering affair, and she would wake with the gray dawn, her body aching and the profound, crushing weight of her solitude pressing down on her. Her days fell into a grim, necessary rhythm. The most immediate problem was winter. It was already in the air, a sharp, metallic tang on the wind, a brittleness in the morning light. The slopes were painted in the drab, dying colors of late autumn. Winter on this mountain was not a gentle season of frosted panes and cozy fires. It was a siege. To survive it, she needed shelter, real shelter, and fuel. The bothy was a ruin, impossible to rebuild with her own two hands. A new cabin was out of the question. She had no timber, no skill, and no money. That left fuel. Firewood was life. The slopes around her offered little. The trees were stunted, twisted things, bent into tortured shapes by the wind, their wood dense but scarce. She spent her days foraging, her back bent, her eyes scanning the ground for any fallen branch, any dead shrub that could be burned. It was a slow, discouraging task. For a full day's work, she would have a meager bundle of sticks that would burn for only a few hours. It was during one of these foraging expeditions that her life pivoted on a detail so small it would have been invisible to anyone else, anyone not stripped down to the raw essentials of survival. She was working her way through the rubble of the old bothy, prying at the heavy, dark stones in the faint hope of finding old, forgotten timbers buried beneath. The wind was particularly vicious that day, a physical blow that made her eyes water and her fingers numb. As she heaved a large, flat slab of granite aside, she felt it. A puff of air from the cavity beneath, a breath from the earth. And it was warm. It was not hot, not even truly warm, but it was distinctly, miraculously less cold than the air biting at her face. She froze, her hands still braced on the stone. She leaned closer, her cheek near the dark opening. Again she felt it, a slow, steady exhalation from the ground. It was faint, but it was there. The air smelled of damp soil, of deep, undisturbed stone, of mushrooms and minerals. It was the smell of a cellar, the smell of the deep-down places of the world. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear as a shard of glass. Her grandmother, a woman from a land of harsh winters and ancient wisdom, sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She had been telling stories of the old ways. "The earth has a slow heart, child," she'd said, her voice a low murmur. "The summer sun sinks deep into the soil and the rock, and the earth holds that warmth long after the sky has turned to iron. It keeps a secret summer deep in its bones." At the time, it had been just a piece of folklore, a quaint saying. Now, kneeling in the wind on a barren mountain, it felt like a prophecy. An idea, wild and improbable, began to form in her mind. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. Everyone on this mountain built up, reaching for the sun, building thick walls to fight the cold. They saw the ground as the enemy, the frozen, dead thing that leached the heat from their hearths. What if they were wrong? What if the earth wasn't the enemy? What if it was the answer? The collapsed bothy wasn't a ruin to be cleared away. It was a beginning. It was a wound in the earth that she could enlarge. She wouldn't build a house on the land. She would build a house in the land. She would dig. She would burrow into the slope, using the existing depression of the foundation, and let the great insulating mass of the mountain be her walls. She would wrap herself in the earth's slow, steady warmth, its secret summer. The sheer folly of it almost made her laugh. It was the plan of a desperate animal, a badger or a fox. The townspeople already thought she was mad with grief. What would they think when they saw her digging her own hole in the ground? They would call her the Mole Woman. They would be certain she was digging her own grave. Let them, she thought, a spark of defiance flaring in the cold emptiness of her chest. Their conventional wisdom had led them to build drafty wooden boxes that devoured firewood and shivered in the wind. Their pity did nothing to warm her. Her desperation had become a kind of freedom. When you have nothing left to lose, you are free to try anything. That night, for the first time in months, she did not shiver in her tent. She was warmed by the heat of an idea, a fierce, desperate, and utterly insane plan that felt in her bones more right than anything she had ever known. The deal was done. She would not fight the mountain. She would join it. The work began the next morning. It was a labor of brutal simplicity. The task was not one of construction, but of deconstruction and excavation. The old bothy had been built on a spot where the slope dipped slightly, a shallow bowl in the mountainside. Its builders had dug down a few feet to anchor the foundation to the bedrock. This initial depression was her starting point. Her first days were spent simply clearing the loose rubble, tossing the smaller stones down the slope where they clattered and rolled into the gorse. The larger ones, the great granite blocks of the foundation, were another matter. They were immense, heavy with the weight of centuries. She had no levers long enough, no ropes strong enough. She had only her own muscles, the pickaxe, and the heavy mallet. Her process was agonizingly slow, a study in leverage and patience. She would use the pickaxe to chip away at the earth packed around a stone, creating a small space, a purchase point. Then she would wedge the blade of the shovel into the gap and heave with all her weight, her body straining, the muscles in her back and arms screaming in protest. Sometimes the stone would shift, a grating, geological groan that was her victory. More often it would not budge, and she would have to start again, chipping away, finding a new angle. Her hands, soft from a life lived indoors, were quickly rubbed raw. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving weeping sores that stung in the cold air. She tore strips from one of her spare blouses to wrap them, the crude bandages quickly becoming stained with dirt and blood. Every evening she would stumble back to her tent, her body a single throbbing ache. She would heat beans over her small fire and eat them mechanically, too exhausted to taste them, before collapsing into a sleep so deep it was like a small death. A week into this grueling routine, she had her first visitor. It was Silas, a farmer from the nearest homestead a mile down the valley. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the mountain, his face a roadmap of wind and worry. He was a widower too, his wife taken by a fever 3 winters past. He approached her cautiously, leading a mule laden with a few supplies. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Woman," he said, his voice rough as burlap, "what in God's name are you doing?" He gestured with his chin towards the chaotic pit of stone and earth she had created. Alara straightened up, wiping a smear of mud from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was tired, sore, and in no mood for judgment. "I'm building a house," she said, her voice flat. Silas looked from the hole to her, and a flicker of something, pity, disbelief, crossed his face. "A house? That's a grave you're digging. The ground here freezes solid, 5 feet deep. You'll be encased in ice before the solstice. Alistair's been telling folks you've lost your senses." I didn't want to believe him, but this... He shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. "This is folly. Take my advice. Pack up your tent. Come down to the valley. The church can find you a place to stay, some work sewing or cleaning. No one will think less of you for it." She looked at her hands, at the raw, torn skin of her palms. She thought of the stifling pity in the valley, the whispers, the life of a charity case dependent on the scraps of other people's kindness. Then she thought of the warm breath from the earth, the secret summer her grandmother had spoken of. "I appreciate the concern, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'm staying." He stared at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He saw no madness in her eyes, only a terrifying, bone-deep exhaustion and a core of resolve that startled him. He sighed, a gust of white vapor in the cold air. "Stubborn as the granite you're trying to move," he muttered. He untied a sack from his mule. Well, if you're determined to kill yourself, you might as well do it on a full stomach. He handed her the sack. It contained a loaf of dense, dark bread, a wheel of hard cheese, and a jar of pickled beets. It was a king's feast. And use this, he added, pulling a pair of thick leather work gloves from his belt. Your hands are a mess. He didn't wait for her thanks. He simply turned his mule and walked away. His shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of her foolishness. Silas's visit was the first crack in the wall of her isolation. He did not believe in her plan, but he had seen her work, and some part of him, the pragmatic farmer part, respected the sheer physical effort. He started leaving things for her at the bottom of the path once a week. A sack of potatoes, a jug of milk, once a small tin of precious coffee. He never came up to the site again, never spoke to her. They were offerings left at the altar of a doomed endeavor, small acts of kindness that she accepted with a gratitude so fierce it bordered on pain. The gloves were a revelation. They protected her hands, allowing her to work longer, harder. The food gave her strength. She was still alone, but she was no longer entirely forgotten. The opposition, however, also grew. Alistair began to make his visits more frequent. He would stand at the edge of the growing pit, his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw her toil not as a sign of determination, but as proof of her unraveling mind. Her project was a public spectacle that confirmed everything he'd been saying about her. "Still at it, Alara?" he would call down, his voice dripping with mock concern. "You'll hit the fires of hell if you keep digging like that. Or maybe that's the point. Trying to get warm?" His laughter was as sharp and cold as the wind. She learned to ignore him, to turn her back and focus on the stone in front of her, letting his words wash over her like the wind. Her silence infuriated him more than any retort could have. It denied him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The work evolved. As she cleared the footprint of the old bothy, she began to dig deeper into the slope, carving a rectangular cavern out of the mountainside. The soil was dense, packed with stone, but after the first few feet of frozen topsoil, it became softer, easier to work, and warmer. Every foot she descended, the temperature became more stable, the air less bitingly cold. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. She was digging her way to that secret summer. The stones she excavated were not discarded. She sorted them, setting aside the large, flat-faced granite blocks. These, she knew, would be her walls. She began the painstaking process of dry stone walling, fitting the stones together without mortar, using their weight and shape to lock them into a stable, formidable barrier. This was an ancient art, one she learned through trial and error. Her first attempts were clumsy, unstable, but she was a patient student. She studied the way the original bothy builders had laid their foundation stones. She learned to see the way the stones wanted to fit, to feel the balance and friction between them. Slowly, painstakingly, 2 retaining walls began to rise, flanking the entrance to her earthen cavern. The whole became a room. It was about 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, dug straight back into the hill. The rear and sides were packed earth, and the front was framed by her new stone walls. The greatest challenge was the roof. She had no timber for beams. Instead, she used the largest, flattest slabs of granite she could find and move. Working with smaller stones and the pickaxe, she would undercut one of these massive slabs where it lay, then slowly, painstakingly, drag and roll it over the opening of her cavern. It was perilous, back-breaking work. A single mistake, a single slip could crush her. But desperation gave her a strange, focused strength. One by one, she moved 5 enormous slabs into place, laying them across the tops of her stone walls and the earthen bank at the rear. They fit together imperfectly, leaving gaps and cracks. She spent a week filling these gaps with smaller stones, then covered the entire stone roof with a thick layer of the clay-heavy soil she had excavated, packing it down, and finally laying turf on top. When she was done, The structure was almost invisible from a distance. It looked like a natural fold in the land, a small green hummock with a dark stone-faced opening. Inside, it was a different world. The moment she stepped through the low doorway, the relentless howl of the Widowmaker was silenced, replaced by a profound, muffled quiet. The air was still and cool, but not cold. It held a steady, neutral temperature, the temperature of a deep cellar. The earthen walls seemed to breathe a calm energy. It was dark, but a single candle flame burned steadily, without a flicker, its light pushing back the shadows. She had built a space that was not so much a house as it was a part of the mountain itself. It was a den, a burrow, a sanctuary. As the first real snows began to fall, dusting the peaks with white, she worked on the interior. She built a small, efficient stove from a rusted metal drum she had found half buried in the gorse, running a narrow pipe up through a carefully constructed chimney in the roof. The stove was for cooking and for taking the chill off the air, but she knew it would not be her primary source of heat. That was the earth itself, the immense thermal battery she was now living inside. She built a simple bed frame in one corner, a table and a stool. She sealed the entrance with a heavy door made from the planks of her disassembled packing crates, insulated with rags and canvas. She was ready. The whispers from the valley had solidified into a local legend. They called her the Mole Woman of Goat's Folly. They spoke of her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Alistair had made sure of that. He told everyone she was living in a hole like an animal, that she had gone feral with grief. He was waiting for the first big storm to prove him right, to be the one to lead the rescue party that would find her frozen body. He was already talking to the town magistrate about his claim on the abandoned land. Then the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind fell silent. It was an unnatural quiet, a deep, held breath that every person on the mountain recognized. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the strange, greasy texture of the clouds, and nodded grimly. The gray Widowmaker was gathering its strength. This was not going to be a simple storm. This was going to be a reckoning. The forecast, crackling over the battery-powered radios in the valley, spoke of a blizzard of historic proportions, a white death that would last for days. There was a frantic scurry of preparation. People boarded their windows, brought their livestock into their barns, and stacked firewood inside their homes until the piles reached the ceilings. They were hunkering down for a siege. In her earthen home, Alara felt the change too. The silence outside was so absolute it seemed to press against her eardrums. She brought in her last bundle of scavenged firewood, a small but precious supply. She checked the seal on her door and lit a single candle. The quiet inside her shelter was different from the quiet outside. Hers was a calm, steady peace. The silence of the world outside was the silence of a predator gathering itself to spring. She sat on her stool, sipping a hot cup of weak tea, and waited. The first flakes were gentle, almost hesitant. Then, as dusk fell, the storm hit. It did not arrive. It detonated. The wind came back not as a moan, but as a physical scream, a solid wall of sound and fury that shook the very foundations of the world. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of ice particles. In the valley, the houses groaned under the assault. The wind found every crack, every seam, turning cozy living rooms into drafty ice boxes. The noise was deafening, a constant shrieking battle between wood and wind. Fires that had seemed more than adequate were now roaring, consuming cordwood at an alarming rate as families huddled closer, feeling the heat being stolen away from them. Up on the mountain, Silas sat in his sturdy farmhouse, a home that had stood for 3 generations, and he was afraid. The wind was hitting his west-facing wall like a battering ram. He could hear the timbers of the roof groaning under the rapidly accumulating weight of the snow. A fine, glittering dust of snow was being driven through the window frames, coating the sills in white. His fire was a ravenous beast, and his woodpile, which he had thought would last a month, was visibly shrinking. The cold was a physical presence, a creeping intruder that his fire could not seem to push back. He thought of the woman up on the hill, the mad woman, the mole woman. He pictured her in her flimsy tent and shuddered. No one could survive this outside. Then he remembered the pit she had been digging, the stone walls she had been building. He had dismissed it as a grave. Now, listening to his own house threatening to tear itself apart, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. What if her madness had a method to it? It was a foolish thought, born of fear, but it would not leave him. Inside Ilara's burrow there was only a distant muted roar, as if the storm were happening in another country. The wind screamed and howled far above her turf-covered roof, but not a whisper of it penetrated her walls. The ground around her, insulated by the deep blanket of snow above, held its steady, cool temperature, and her tiny stove had to work only a little to raise the air to a comfortable warmth. The candle flame did not even tremble. She was warm. She was safe. She listened to the muffled fury of the world outside from a place of impossible peace. She ate her dinner of hot bean soup and felt a profound, quiet sense of vindication that was so overwhelming it felt like a prayer. She had not conquered the mountain. She had deferred to its wisdom. For 2 days the storm raged without pause. On the third morning, Silas woke to a terrifying crack. A main beam in his roof, overloaded with snow, had split. A cascade of snow and splintered wood fell into his attic. His house was failing. His firewood was almost gone. The cold was now unbearable, his breath pluming in his own kitchen. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. He was an old man, alone. If his roof collapsed, if his fire went out, he would die. And then the thought of Ilara returned. No longer a sliver of doubt, but a desperate, grasping hope. It was insane. She was probably already dead. But his options were gone. Staying here was a death sentence. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, took up a sturdy walking stick, and stepped out into the blizzard. It was like stepping into a churning sea of white. The world was gone, erased. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The wind knocked him staggering, and the snow was so deep it came up to his waist, a thick, heavy powder that made every step a monumental effort. He had no compass, only a deep, instinctual knowledge of his own land. He aimed himself towards Goat's Folly and began to fight his way uphill, a tiny, struggling figure in a world of white chaos. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes took him nearly 2 hours. He fell countless times, the snow instantly covering him, trying to claim him. He was guided by memory and by the faint, darker shape of the ridge against the whiteout. He was on the verge of collapse, his body numb, his hope failing, when he stumbled, quite literally, into it. One moment he was wading through a deep drift. The next his foot caught on something hard, and he fell forward, his face landing near a low wall of stone, swept mostly clear of snow by the eddying wind. He saw the door, a dark rectangle in the snow-plastered stone. There was no light, no sound. He felt a wave of despair. He had been a fool. She was dead. He had risked his life for nothing. Still, he hammered on the rough plank door with his frozen fist. "Ilara," he croaked, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Ilara." He was about to give up, to lie down and let the snow take him, when the door scraped open. A sliver of warm, candle-lit air washed over his face. It smelled of wood smoke and baked bread. Ilara stood there, her face calm, holding a candle. She looked at his snow-caked form, at the desperation in his eyes, and simply stepped back, holding the door open for him. He stumbled inside, into the quiet, into the warmth. He collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. For a long moment he could not speak. He could only stare. The small room was impossibly, blessedly warm. The air was still. The candle on the table burned with a serene, unwavering flame. A small pot simmered on the tiny stove. It was a haven, a pocket of impossible calm carved out of the heart of the tempest. He looked at the earthen walls, the stone roof, and finally at Alara, who was wrapping a blanket around his shoulders and pressing a hot mug of tea into his trembling hands. "How?" he finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with disbelief and awe. "How is this possible?" Alara looked around her small, sturdy home, at the earthen walls that held the storm at bay. She did not need to explain the principles of thermal mass or the insulating properties of snow. She did not need to speak of her grandmother's wisdom or her own desperation. The proof was all around them. She simply gave him a small, tired smile. "I listened," she said. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world that emerged was transformed and brutalized. The sun shone on a landscape buried under 10 feet of snow. In the valley, the damage was immense. Several roofs had collapsed. Livestock had been lost. One elderly couple, their firewood running out, had been found frozen in their home. The story of Silas's survival, however, spread like wildfire. He told everyone who would listen, his voice filled with a convert's zeal. He described the impossible warmth and quiet of Ilara's shelter. He described how she had saved his life. He took them up the mountain, a small procession of stunned and humbled men, to see for themselves. They stood at the entrance to her home, their hats in their hands, staring in silence. They saw not a grave, but a miracle of common sense. Alistair was among them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His narrative of the mad, grieving widow had been shattered. He saw her now not as a victim he could exploit, but as a force he could not comprehend. When he tried to bluster, to claim she had been lucky, Silas turned on him with a cold fury. This woman survived with a handful of sticks while good men nearly froze to death surrounded by cordwood, Silas said, his voice ringing with authority. That ain't luck. That's wisdom. The kind you can't buy, Alistair. The kind you have to earn. Alistair, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. He turned and left, his public humiliation complete. The perception of Alara shifted overnight. She was no longer the mole woman. She was the woman who had listened to the mountain. In the weeks that followed, as the community dug out and repaired, they came to her not with pity, but with respect. They brought her gifts of food, tools, and timber. They asked her questions. They wanted to understand what she had done. She showed them the simple, profound logic of her design, how the earth insulated, how the snow itself became a blanket, how working with the landscape was easier than fighting against it. That spring, 3 families whose homes had been destroyed came to her for help. They asked her to show them how to build their own earth-sheltered homes. She did. She worked alongside them, sharing the knowledge she had bought so dearly with her own pain and labor. Her design, refined and improved, became a new standard in the region. The houses were sturdy, warm, and efficient, standing as a testament to the quiet revolution she had started. Goat's Folly was no longer a punchline. It was a destination. Decades passed. The woman who had arrived on the mountain with nothing but a worthless deed and a broken heart lived a long and peaceful life. Her home, the original hearth, became the center of a small, thriving community of other earth-sheltered houses that dotted the slope, their turf roofs greening in the summer sun. She was never lonely again. She became a matriarch, a figure of respect, a keeper of the kind of wisdom that grows not in books, but in the earth itself. The story of her first winter, of her desperate digging, became a local legend, a story told to children by the fire on cold nights. It became a story about the nature of value. It taught that what appears worthless on the surface can hold the secret to survival deep within. It was a lesson in perception, a reminder that the most powerful solutions are sometimes found not by shouting over the storm, but by listening to the quiet, steady heartbeat of the world. The greatest treasures are not always the ones that glitter, but the ones buried in the dark, waiting for a hand desperate enough to dig, and a heart brave enough to trust in the warmth of the Earth's secret summer.